All right, hello everybody. Excited to be here at Ignite. My name is Hallberg. I am the director of the product team for Azure DevOps. I've been with the team since way back in 2007, so I've been involved in pretty much every ship since Team Foundation Server 2008, which feels like a very long time. On a personal note, I grew up in Iowa City. That's a suburb of Chicago, about 4 hours west. And a whole lot of my extended family is here in the Chicago area, so I'm super excited to be in Chicago with you all today talking about Azure DevOps and GitHub.
Good afternoon. Let's try that again. We want to get the energy up here. Good afternoon. Hi, I'm Dave Burnison. I'm a senior DevOps advocate with GitHub, but I've also worked with the Azure DevOps team, so an advocate for both Azure DevOps and GitHub. And I also grew up in Iowa, but down in the southwest corner of Iowa. And my spouse's family is here in the Chicago area, even though we live in Washington now. But I was able to spend some time with family this weekend, so that was really great. But I'm very excited to be here with you today.
Two Iowa boys, crazy. Let's see, so we're going to be talking today about Azure DevOps and GitHub. So to start, for folks who aren't aware, Microsoft has two very successful DevSecOps products in the market, Azure DevOps and GitHub. So Azure DevOps has a large enterprise customer base, and I'm sure a lot of you, I think, have come talk to me at the booth, so it probably includes a lot of you. In general, our customers really like the customizable enterprise planning and tracking capabilities in Azure Boards, the robust continuous integration and continuous delivery capabilities in Azure Pipelines, the manual and exploratory testing capabilities in Azure Test Plans, and especially all of the integrations across the entire suite. GitHub is the world's largest developer community with over 100 million developers. In addition to that, it serves over 4 million organizations, including 90% of the Fortune 100. It's beloved by developers, and it's at the forefront of innovation with features like GitHub Copilot, the world's most widely adopted AI developer tool, GitHub Advanced Security, including AI-driven auto fixes for security issues, and GitHub Codespaces, which enables developers to spin up development environments in just seconds. So, a lot of Azure DevOps customers have been looking at all this innovation coming out of GitHub and wondering how they can get the benefits of that innovation without losing access to the things that they love about Azure DevOps. And so that's the point of our talk today. We're going to focus especially on how we're helping customers to get the best of both worlds by using Azure DevOps and GitHub together. That includes both GitHub value that Azure DevOps customers have access to today, as well as GitHub value that Azure DevOps customers can get access to by migrating some or all of their repositories to GitHub while continuing to use other features in Azure DevOps like boards and pipelines through our integrations. So to get into that, we're going to do one demo two ways. So we'll start by running through the demo with the full Azure DevOps suite, Azure Repos, Azure Boards, Azure Pipelines, highlighting some of the unique value in Azure DevOps that customers love, along with the value that they can get from GitHub Advanced Security for Azure DevOps and GitHub Copilot for Business, while still continuing to use that full suite of capabilities in Azure DevOps. And then we'll go through that same demo a second time, this time with our repos stored in GitHub. And that time through, we'll highlight all of the spots where having repos in GitHub unlocks additional value for Azure DevOps customers, as well as all the spots where integrations between the two products enable developers to still have a great experience that feels like using a unified suite. All right, so with that, we are actually first, I just want to say if you want to see a bit more information about the configuration from this first demo, where you're using the full suite in Azure DevOps and then using other capabilities in GitHub, like GitHub Advanced Security for Azure DevOps and Copilot. This is a great customer story that you can read through. And we'll have another one for the other scenario as well. And with that, we'll flip over to demo mode for a while.
All right, thanks, Aaron. All right, so hopefully this looks familiar to a lot of you. You've set up nice, rich dashboards and everything where you've turned queries into nice widgets to show all the value going on in your project, being able to display your queries and everything right here, even taking advantage of the built-in widgets to say, hey, what work is assigned to me, filter it down to bugs and things like that. Also taking advantage of the typical backlog and even being able to go all the way from epics down to features, PBIs, tasks, etc., being able to manage that in sprints and everything else. But then also taking advantage of the nice customizable Kanban boards with being able to show bugs and user stories and have customization, such as I have here. Anything that's priority 1 gets highlighted in yellow, or being able to put things in a specific swim lane. So lots of customization and everything. We know a large percentage of our Azure DevOps users use boards all the time. So we've got a work item here we want to focus in on. So the demo environment is Parts Unlimited. How many out there have read the Phoenix project? All right, yep, I see a few hands out there. So Parts Unlimited is that auto parts store that was struggling to get online and everything. And part of those struggles, they starting out as a brick and mortar store, they were just charging sales tax locally, but now they need to do that in the location of the buyer, not just for Parts Unlimited. So taking a look at this user story, here's where GitHub Copilot can help even while the code lives in Azure DevOps. So in this case, my code's living in Azure DevOps, but we're going to take advantage of GitHub Copilot right from Visual Studio.
And Dave, real quick, so yep. This is our first spot, right, where Azure DevOps customers can get value out of GitHub today without doing anything to migrate or start using other features of GitHub Enterprise, so on and so forth. So in talking to folks, I don't think everybody knows this, but GitHub Copilot for Business is available to all customers, including Azure DevOps customers. You can manage license using enterprise accounts without needing to pay for GitHub Enterprise seats for all of the users. And while we'll see in our second demo, some of the features of GitHub Copilot only light up if you have your code stored in GitHub and are using the platform more deeply. Many of the powerful capabilities of Copilot are available right within your integrated development environment, either VS or VS Code, and do not require any deeper integrations or usage of the broader GitHub platform. So that includes things like code completions, the chat capabilities, including workspace context, including extensions, and lots more. So Dave's going to illustrate some of those capabilities available to Azure DevOps customers right in Visual Studio.
So one of the things I want to do here is, I'm new to the project. I'm not real familiar with the code. So first thing I want to figure out is where are we calculating sales tax? So I'm just going to ask Copilot, and I'm going to use the workspace participant here that's built right into Visual Studio. Where in this workspace do we have code that calculates sales tax? Now, pretty quickly, hopefully, it's going to come back and show us exactly where that code lives and even kind of highlight that specific calculate tax method. And we can see here that sure enough, yeah, it's hard-coded for the postal codes in Washington and things like that, but we need to do better. So I'm going to open that file, and yep, we can see calculate tax there and everything. Now the next prompt, I want to be general, so I'm going to say I don't want to include the active document, but here's where we can leverage the @GitHub participant. So what that does is that's doing an actual internet search for this question. So I'm going to say, are there any third-party APIs that I can use to calculate sales tax in any postal code? And this should come back with a number of them. Let's see, we got TaxJar, Avalara, Tax.io. Great, so I think TaxJar probably looks like a good one. So now, since I have this file open, I'm going to go back and say include the active document in the prompt, and I'll say, how would we update, calculate tax? And like I said, I'll pick TaxJar here. And it should come back and tell us everything that we need to do to update our code, including it even starts from the beginning. Here's how you install the TaxJar package. We need to update the calculate tax method. It's showing us the exact code we need and everything. So if I didn't want to do this right now, I could take that information and put that back in the user story as kind of a recipe to complete that work and everything.
Okay, great. I think one other thing we were going to try and highlight was the model picker as well.
Oh, yes.
That's another great capability available.
One of the things that was recently added here is we started out with ChatGPT. Here in Visual Studio, you can see we're also allowing you to pick 𝗦1 Preview and 𝗦1 Mini. And last month at GitHub Universe, we announced that you'll be able to also pick Claude or Gemini as a model. So really giving you the choices that you can leverage for your situation. If you're working with legacy code, one model might work better than writing greenfield code or something like that. So giving you those kind of options.
Awesome. So as you can see, a whole bunch of the GitHub Copilot value is available to Azure DevOps customers right through your IDE without needing to do anything else to change your workflow. That set of changes is a little complicated for our demo, though, so we're going to switch gears and focus on something a little simpler to get through the rest of the content.
So Parts Unlimited had their struggles, right? So they were owned by Contoso, but now Fabricam has acquired Parts Unlimited. So the work that we need to do is we need to go through and update the subsidiary name that shows up in the header of the web pages, is embedded throughout. We want to change that to Fabricam. So when I open up this user story, I can go in here and say, okay, I'm ready to start working on this. Let me go ahead and create a new branch. And so if I put in my branch name there, I want to bring up this flow because we'll notice later in GitHub we're using the exact same flow. You can see I've already created a branch for this. Kind of doing that cooking show methodology, right? We're not going to sit here and wait for everything to bake, but we'll go through all the steps and show you that. So that branch shows up right here so that we've got traceability back and forth and everything. So I can go to that branch, work on my code and everything. Also from a traceability standpoint, so I'd make the code changes there in Visual Studio. We can see we've even got Fabricam already plugged in here. So I make my code changes, push everything up right from Visual Studio and such. And then get back to that board. There we go. Now I can go into the pull request. So in the pull request, you can see we've got, again, our traceability. Everything shows up here, so somebody's looking at this later, they know exactly what work we're working on here and everything. We can see that some of the code has been reviewed and everything, but also something else that's popping up here now is we have GitHub Advanced Security for Azure DevOps plugged right in, and one of the recent additions there was when Gazdo finds a security alert as part of a pull request build, it will then actually put a note right in the pull request notes. We call that the PR annotations.
So this is our second big spot where Azure DevOps customers can get value out of GitHub right in Azure DevOps. So GitHub Advanced Security for Azure DevOps was first released at Build last year, and it brought the core capabilities of GitHub Advanced Security, including secret scanning, code scanning, and dependency vulnerability scanning, to Azure DevOps customers right in their existing workflows. Since then, we've delivered a steady stream of value to GASDO, as we affectionately call GitHub Advanced Security for Azure DevOps. It's a bit of a mouthful if you say the whole thing every time. And one of the most recent additions, as Dave alluded to, is the PR annotations feature, where newly introduced code or dependency vulnerabilities will show up right in the pull request so that developers can fix them before they ever make it into the code base in the first place.
So when we go back into that PR again, the other thing that we see here is it's gone through our PR build. You know, we want to build, we want to run our unit tests, maybe we're doing some linting and other things. If we dive into the pipeline, we can see we've got multiple stages here. And there we go. We've got multiple stages here, but if I edit the pipeline, we want to point out a few things about how you can have templates and enforce, compliance and things via those templates.
Yeah, so one of the reasons customers love Azure Pipelines and want to keep using it even if they migrate repos over to GitHub is because of some of these differentiated features that exist in it today. So this pipeline is using a feature that we call extends templates. And that feature is really a cornerstone of security and compliance for many Azure DevOps customers, including Microsoft itself. So the way this feature works is it enables you to define a template and then enforce its use if you want to do something like, for example, deploy into a production environment. Within the template, you can then do things like implement best practices across your org, prevent unwanted behaviors, that sort of thing. And so in this case, we've got our main pipeline, and you can see it's pulling in a template from a completely different repository, which then enables you to apply different security on that template than you do on kind of the leaf node pipeline. If you can navigate into the template, maybe.
But centralizing that in another repository means all of our projects can leverage what we're going to show next, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we navigate to that template, you'll see it supports other things like marking that template as not skippable. So that means the things that are happening in that template are going to be enforced across every pipeline that derives from it. And in this case, we're also going to do a bunch of things in that template around security, right? So it's going to force basically CodeQL and other security tooling to run in every pipeline across our project. All right, so let's hop back out. The other thing we'll see here is that this particular template is also specifying a particular pool. In this case, something called the Parts Unlimited MDP pool. So that pool, in this case, is actually what's called a Managed DevOps pool. Managed DevOps pools are a feature that went GA, I think, 2 days ago. And this is a type of pool that enables you to get kind of the best of both worlds in terms of managed offering, as well as the flexibility and power associated with self-hosted agents. So if we navigate to that pool, essentially these are pools that give you sort of dynamic capacity in Azure. They let you do things like pick the SKU you're going to use, pick the networking configuration you're going to use, and then they manage a bunch of things for you. So they will scale up and down as needed as your pipeline jobs kind of come into the queue. So that'll both save you money and make sure there's not a lot of unneeded machines sort of sitting around. One of the other features, if you go to the pool setting, and then scroll down, you'll see that there are a bunch of different image types available, including the images that are used in our managed agents for Azure pipelines as well. This has been a long requested feature from customers, so they don't have to build their images up themselves, and it really simplifies things quite a bit. So in this case, we're using one of those baked-in images, but we're scaling up the power of the machines so that our security tooling can run nice and fast. But again, if you want to do things like custom networking, all that kind of stuff, that's also available. We're going to keep investing in managed DevOps pools in the coming months. So there are some exciting upcoming features there, including support for container-based agents, support for spot VMs to help reduce costs, and lots more as well.
So one of the things to note here, I think, is this was actually defined and configured at the organization level, right? Mm-hmm. So all of our projects can take advantage of these pools, even though maybe your project set it up, my project can also take advantage of that pool.
Absolutely. And one other note on managed DevOps pools. So this is a feature that was first developed for use within Microsoft itself. We've been using what were originally called 1ES hosted pools, was the name internally, for the past several years to manage and enforce security and compliance for our CI/CD compute across the entire company. So this is a great case where Microsoft's own use of Azure DevOps is now delivering value to external customers as well.
All right, so let's go back to our, let's see, we want to get back to the pull request now, don't we?
Yep.
All right, so now, it's gone through the security checks. We see we've got some work we'll have to eventually do here. We've had the code reviews and everything on here. So, they're saying the code looks good. So now we can go ahead and complete this pull request. And what this will do, this will actually go ahead and complete the associated work items and everything and go ahead and delete that branch. So it makes it easy to clean up everything for us. So if I can get back to the, am I going to be able to get back to the board fast enough? Nope. I should have had the board ready to go there.
So you'll see the state is now transitioned to done, right? And so that's sort of the end of a typical sort of Azure DevOps end-to-end sort of traceability and integration demo. And along the way, right, we started with a work item. We saw how to create a branch from that work item. That sets up all the links that then get accumulated in that work item to commits, to pull requests, to the pipelines. And then in the end, right, that pull request, when we merge it, the work item itself transitions all the way to complete. So this is the sort of like integration and end-to-end traceability that Azure DevOps customers are used to when using Azure DevOps altogether. So that's the end of our first demo. Our second demo, we're going to do the same thing, but with our repos in GitHub. Highlighting the integrations that still exist between the two products, as well as some of the additional value you can get from GitHub if you migrate your repos from Azure Repos over into GitHub. So the first step here to getting that all working is to install our two apps. So we have two apps that really are the foundation of the integrations between Azure DevOps and GitHub. There's an Azure Boards app and an Azure Pipelines app. And I'll note that many customers are already using these apps today to integrate Azure DevOps and GitHub. In October, customers created over 800,000 links between Azure Boards work items and GitHub repositories. And the single biggest customer created more than 60,000 just on their own. In pipeline space, similarly, customers all up ran over 32 million Azure Pipelines jobs that consumed GitHub repositories. And the single biggest customer using the Azure Pipelines integration ran over 2 million jobs in just a month, all on their own. So these apps are really the foundation of the integrations. There's a lot of customers using them today, and we hope you all would be interested in exploring them as well. Normally, I wouldn't worry about showing you how to install these apps, but I did want to highlight that we're going to be supporting GitHub Enterprise Cloud with data residency imminently for both apps. So for those who don't know, GitHub Enterprise Cloud with data residency is a new version of GitHub Enterprise Cloud that was announced just a couple months ago. It's generally available today in Europe, and it's coming soon to other regions as well. It supports both data residency and enterprise identity isolation through customer-specific domains. And so I did want to just highlight that that's going to be supported relatively soon as well. And the little demo here is just kind of walking through what the configuration looks like. You initiate it right from Azure DevOps, and then you get the same sort of connection set up that you would with GitHub Enterprise Cloud. Finally, speaking of enterprise identity, for Azure DevOps customers, we generally recommend using GitHub's Enterprise Managed Users feature with the same Entra tenant backing your Azure DevOps organization and your GitHub organization. This can greatly simplify user management, permission management, and so forth, especially if you use the same Entra groups to manage membership in both Azure DevOps security groups on the one hand and GitHub security roles on the other. Okay, so with that set up, I mentioned we'd have a customer story for the other scenario too. So if you'd like an example of the approach that we're going to go through now, using GitHub repos, Azure Boards and pipelines, and then other features in GitHub like Copilot, Advanced Security, and Codespaces, this customer story is a good place to start and to read a bit more. So with that, we'll get back into demo mode.
All right, so here's the version of our team project where the code is actually stored in GitHub. So you'll see we turned off Azure repos here. Now, one thing I did to be able to quickly access the code is I leveraged the Markdown widget. So I've even got right in here where I can jump directly to code or pull requests or security alerts, whatever. But realizing that I could do that for GitHub, it's like, well, we're deploying to Azure, so my tip would be also have your Azure resources right there, easily accessible in a Markdown widget kind of a thing. So, yep, same thing. We can take advantage of all the beautiful reporting like these widgets and stuff. But now we want to hop into the sales tax calculation thing, right? So this time, look at our board. It's going to look very similar. Here's the third-party tax calculation thing. Oh, and check this out. Here's already an annotation for GitHub. If I go in, and I'll show how to do this in a moment, I can create a branch directly in GitHub right from my user story. Now, for now, I just want to use this to jump into GitHub itself. So this is the user interface for GitHub. A key thing we want to highlight here is we have Copilot now right on github.com. And this is available for Copilot Business, Copilot Enterprise, etc. And we should have cleared that. So we're going to start out with the same question here. Where in this repo do we have code that calculates sales tax?
And so while Dave's doing that, so this is our first spot again, where if you've moved your repos over into GitHub, you can get some additional value that's not available if your repos are stored in Azure DevOps. So we talked about in the first demo how a lot of Copilot capabilities are available right in the IDE, but obviously some are available also in github.com, and some are enhanced by having your code and other assets stored in GitHub, and thereby contributing to sort of the knowledge graph that's available for Copilot to act on. So generally, the way to think about it is for customers using the full Azure DevOps suite, Copilot capabilities available in the IDE are available. And then if you move your repos over to GitHub, a bunch of additional Copilot goodness lights up in github.com and in the form of advanced features like fine-tuned models and so on and so forth.
One of the great things about this, I'm sitting here in github.com. I haven't even launched an IDE yet. I'm not in Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. I'm doing this right here. So, okay, great. Here's that same thing. We can dive into the file. We can see our calculate tax function and everything. I can ask a similar question as I asked earlier here. Any third-party APIs that we can use to calculate sales tax in any location. Take a moment to come back. You can see it's doing a Bing search. Okay, so we've got several here. Don't recall which one I picked last time, but let's try tax rate IO this time. Just to prove it's a live demo, picking from the results we got there. But we should see something similar, right? It's going to come back and tell us how do we install this, give us a narrative for what code changes we need to make, and then show us an actual example of the code changes that we need to make. There we go. Just like before, but now we're seeing it on GitHub.com as opposed to diving into our IDE and everything, and even reminding us, making sure we update unit tests and documentation and things like that. So really making sure we check all the boxes, right? All right, so there we go. Come out of here, and I'll go back to the update subsidiary name branch, or work item. And like I said, we can create GitHub branches right in here. So there's our option for a new GitHub branch. And the nice thing about it is that UI looks very familiar, right? This is the same UI we saw when creating a branch in for Azure DevOps.
And of course, this is by design, right? The goal of the integrations between Azure DevOps and GitHub is to make using the two products together feel as familiar as we can to customers and developers that are used to using all Azure DevOps together. So the goal, again, we want it to feel like a deeply integrated suite, and we want it to feel super familiar.
All right, so I'm going to dive into that branch since I already have it created. Now, another thing, for these changes, I can use Visual Studio Code. One of the great things that's available in GitHub.com is Codespaces. So I can go out and spin up a web version of a Codespace or Visual Studio Code, and I've got options here to pick, how big of a machine size do I need? You can set policies for things like this. So for this particular project, if it's not a real beefy project, you can limit those options to ensure you're spending your money efficiently and all of that.
So Codespaces is another GitHub capability that lights up for customers if they move their repos over into GitHub. For folks that aren't familiar with it, it lets you spin up a virtualized VS Code environment super quickly using dev containers. The GitHub team itself has been using Codespaces, and they've reduced their dev environment setup time from 45 minutes or so to under a minute. So it can be really helpful in getting new people started quickly, in saving time for developers that have been around for a while, and so forth.
All right, so I'll come in here and I'll make all of my code changes and everything, and you'll see we have Copilot in here. Even in here, we've got the model picker, and there you go. Now in here in Visual Studio Code, we even see that preview option for Claude as a model and things like that. So we'd make our code changes. Of course, we would push up our pull request and everything. So once we create the pull request, that also is going to show up on our work item here.
So just as with Azure Repos, we're trying to bake in that end-to-end traceability, right? So you saw the link to the GitHub branch, now the link to the GitHub pull request, so on and so forth.
Yep, and just one key note, you want to reference those work items in here as you create your pull requests, as you put in your comments and things, and then you have that traceability back to the work items in Azure Boards, just like we did when the repos were in Azure Boards.
Yeah.
Now, this isn't really much of a description here, right? We would really hope developers would put in better descriptions. Here's another area where now Copilot comes to the rescue. So I can come in here and say, hey, Copilot, can you generate a summary for me? And that'll take a moment, but it'll come back and it'll provide a nice paragraph about the overall changes. And then actually, there we go, came back nice and quickly. So if we look at the preview there, yep, a paragraph about our changes, and then it even highlights file by file the different changes that were made there.
One other note, we saw before the links to the Azure Boards work items in the development control within the pull request. So just as our goal is to update Azure DevOps experiences to make using GitHub repositories feel familiar and like using part of an integrated suite for Azure DevOps customers, we're also updating GitHub experiences to do the same thing. And this is a great example of that. So the Azure Boards work item links show up just like issue links would show up in that same control within the pull request experience on the GitHub side.
All right, so we can see we've got several commits here in the pull request, and they've already been commented on and everything. Scroll down looking through these things, and now we can see we've got GitHub Advanced Security showing up right inside of the pull request here. So I can go in here and see, more details about this issue and everything. And the way GitHub Advanced Security started out, the idea is we know developers are not security experts, so let's see if we can provide, a nice example of how they would need to change the code. In this case, it's saying, okay, your code probably looks like this, and you need to add this validate anti-forgery token, et cetera. But now we've taken it even a step further. If I look at here we go, another PR very similar here, Copilot Autofix is actually giving us that code that we need to make the change here. So I could go ahead and commit that code change right here, or I could create a new branch and isolate that change so we run our unit tests and everything separately. So if this change that Copilot Autofix suggested breaks something, we know it was that and not our code that had those breaking changes.
Now, this is another spot where customers who've migrated their repos over into GitHub will get some additional value out of, in this case, GitHub Advanced Security over GitHub Advanced Security for Azure DevOps. So generally, our goal is to minimize gaps between those two products. But GitHub Advanced Security is always going to be running ahead of GitHub Advanced Security for Azure DevOps. And right now, that means things like autofix for security issues. It means things like the new security campaigns feature that was announced at GitHub Universe, and so forth. And so, while some capabilities of GitHub Advanced Security are available natively within Azure DevOps, there's always going to be some extra stuff running ahead that's going to be available within GitHub for customers that have their repos stored there.
All right, if I scroll down, we can see all the checks completed, and CodeQL is natively part of GitHub. So we didn't have to explicitly call that in the pipelines, but notice we're still using Azure pipelines for our builds and unit tests and things like that. So if I dive in, and just like we had before, we can see there were multiple stages here, nice little summary here, but I can dive right into the Azure Pipelines version of this as well. And one of the things I think is great about this is I can continue to leverage, the richness of Azure Pipelines and seeing all of my tests and everything right here as well. But if we dive, so the pipeline looks somewhat similar, right? We can go in, and if we look at the pipeline here, it's going to look very similar. Here we go. So we have the pipeline template, and just like before, it's using that extends template. And the only other thing is, notice here, the repositories that we're pulling from are in GitHub. So now I can do that same thing. I can have a separate pipeline for all of my templates that we want to use to enforce security, compliance. Maybe we have common build steps just to make it easier to, plug in and go kind of a thing.
So all of those same capabilities we looked at before for Azure pipelines in terms of extends templates, the managed DevOps pools, so on and so forth, those are all still available, even though our repos have moved over into GitHub. Yep. And that's all enabled, of course, by the Azure Pipelines app, which enables triggers to flow back and forth between the two systems and just generally keeps all of this, this goodness in Azure Pipeline space working.
Yep, so same thing. We're leveraging the pool. So even though the managed DevOps pools was set up for Azure DevOps, we're leveraging it here even while our code is in GitHub.
All right. So we've got one more step in our demo. We've got to complete that pull request, and then we'll see all the magic happen on our work item.
Yep, so let me go back to, there we go. Get back to this pull request.
Awesome.
And I want to come in here and get past all of this and say squash and merge. So since we had noted all the work items in there and said fixes AB number 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., now we can go back and actually look at our boards items, and we can see they're done. There's one of the tasks. Here's the user story, and it's done. And if we look at the history, just like we saw before, we should see that that was done just now, kind of a thing.
Awesome. All right, great. So we've highlighted a number of existing integration points between Azure DevOps and GitHub, but we're by no means done with these investments. So if you want to keep up with our investments in improving integrations over time, I highly recommend keeping an eye on our public roadmap. We have a dedicated section in that roadmap specifically for integration investments. So that's a great place to keep an eye on in order to figure out what's coming up next. And I did want to highlight one other thing. So one problem with all this talk about using Azure DevOps and GitHub together is that all the users in your organization, of course, need to have use rights for both products. And while Visual Studio subscribers have had usage rights to both products for a long time by just paying for that one Visual Studio subscription, other users have had to pay for both products independently. But I'm excited to announce that starting in December, we're going to be including Azure DevOps basic use rights with GitHub Enterprise license in a fully automated way. So just as with Visual Studio subscriptions, oops, that went too far. Just as with Visual Studio subscriptions, where am I? Sorry, folks. Nope.
Oh, did the animation not?
The animation did not work.
Uh-oh.
Holy moly. I'm going to stop animating. I'm just going to talk. Just as with Visual Studio subscriptions, when users log into the system, we will automatically determine whether they have GitHub Enterprise licenses. And if they do, we will grant them a GitHub Enterprise license within Azure DevOps that gives them the same use rights as an Azure DevOps basic license. So this is coming in December for GitHub Enterprise Cloud. And it'll come early in the new year for GitHub Enterprise Cloud with Data Residency. Thank you very much, Dave.
You're welcome.
Appreciate that. I wanted to highlight a couple of blog posts as well that folks can go to for additional resources. So this is one that was posted yesterday morning, I believe, that covers a lot of the same stuff that we talked about in here, but with links off to a whole bunch of resources where you can learn more about all of the different bits and pieces that we talked about, as well as additional things like migration tooling and stuff like that. Another one that came out, I think, 2 days ago, we've actually started a new blog on Microsoft. It's called the Microsoft Developers Blog. It's focused on really telling kind of the end-to-end story across all of our different products, including the Visual Studio family, including Azure, including GitHub, and including GitHub Copilot. So I highly recommend checking that blog out as well. This particular post that I'm linking to goes into kind of a more broad discussion of integrations between all those different things beyond just Azure DevOps and GitHub. And with that, I just want to say a big thank you to everybody for attending. We will be at the DevOps booth out in the hub later today, all day tomorrow. So if you have questions about anything you saw here, if you're currently using our integrations and you want to talk about them, we'd love to talk to you. Swing by the booth, ask us questions, strike up a conversation. We'd love to dig a little deeper with you about how you can use the two products together. And with that, I'll just say, please scan that little code. Let us know what you thought. Hope you enjoyed the talk today. It was our great pleasure, I know, to
Absolutely.
Be with you today, and we'll see you in the booth.
Fantastic collaborating with you, Aaron. Thanks.
Thanks.